The 2020 Program Director Survey revealed that letters of recommendations were rated as the second most important factor in selecting candidates to be interviewed. 84% of program directors stated that they took letters of recommendation into account when selecting candidates. So typically candidates are hyper-focused on USMLE and COMLEX scores when thinking about applying to medical residency programs. However, because LORs are the second most important risk factor for you to land an interview, it's very, very important that you do not take these for granted, and more importantly, that you avoid these top 5 mistakes that candidates make when applying for residency. So let's get into the top 5 mistakes that candidates make. Okay, so for mistake number 1, wrong letters of recommendations. So you might be wondering, what does this mean? How can letters of recommendations be wrong? Well, let me explain. This mistake is very common, and what can happen is that, let's say you have an applicant that is applying to internal medicine, but then they submit a well-written letter of recommendation for pediatrics or surgery. So that's one of the mistakes, in that the letter of recommendation is not specific to the specialty that you will be applying to. Another example is, let's say, a candidate that's applying to psychiatry. However, they have LORs from internal medicine, surgery, basically every specialty except for the one that they're actually applying to. This is considered to be a red flag to program directors. Another way that this error can occur is if the letter writer mentions the wrong specialty that you're applying to. So it's very important that you choose your letter writer very, very carefully, and also be sure that when you're contacting the letter writer about writing a letter of recommendation for you, that you specifically state what specialty you will be applying to. Mistake number 2 is submitting generic letters of recommendation. So some key components of generic LORs are that, for one, there are no personal touches, meaning that it doesn't state any unique experience to your rotation or your time with that person or your mentor. And also, it does not have anything specific about your unique strengths or qualities. Another feature of a generic LOR is that it's not specific to a specialty or to you. So let's say that you're applying to general surgery, but because the LOR is so generic, it's basically made of like a template, which is not specific to surgery or specific surgical skills, that could like implore program directors to want to offer you an interview. It's so generic, it could be for any specialty. So it's not specific to the specialty that you're applying to. So typically these generic LORs do have a poor quality compared to LORs that are well written with the personal touches and basically the wording that a letter writer would have for someone who they truly believe in and are passionate about helping that person to match into their specialty and or residency of choice. So typically you want to avoid getting generic letters of recommendations at all costs because, like I said before, they have a poor quality. And the quality of the LOR goes a long way for you to get interviews and eventually rank into your program of choice. So mistake number 3 is geared towards international medical graduates, and that is not having US letters of recommendation. So more and more, it's been shown that programs like to see US letters of recommendations, especially from IMGs, because it basically is a way for you to be evaluated by a US physician and kind of prove that you can adjust to the US system, the US medical system. And also it shows a dedication to not only the specialty, but going to a residency program in the United States, because you took the initiative to go and do a rotation at a US hospital or clinic and be able to get that experience and ultimately a letter of recommendation from that. But an important note is that even though the US letters of recommendations have a very, very high value when applying to residency. This does not mean that having letters written from your home country does not have any value. Like, those can also be very, very, very important as well. But I would recommend to have at least one US letter of recommendation. But it's very important that you also know that for US letters of recommendation, there's kind of a bit of a hierarchy in terms of US hands-on clinical experience is like top notch, like top of the pyramid, and then you'd have different experiences such as telerotations, observerships, or research experience. So observerships are on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of what value they have, because it's preferred that you have hands-on clinical experience rather than observership. If you are currently reviewing programs to apply to, some of them will even state that, hey, observerships or research experience don't count in terms of they'd have a requirement of, let's say, 3 months of US clinical experience or 6 months. I've even seen programs saying 1 to 2 years of US clinical experience. And for these programs, they would exclude observerships and research experience. They prefer hands-on clinical experience. Mistake number 4 is having letters of recommendations written from experiences that are not recent. So let's say that you are a medical graduate of the year 2019 and you have a letter of recommendation written from experiences from 2016. That would not be recent, especially if you're applying in 2021, 2022, and beyond. That would not be considered recent experience. So a good rule of thumb to follow is to have LORs written from experiences that you've done in the last year to 2 years, but preferably within the last year. I understand that this might not be possible for all applicants, but this is a good rule of thumb to keep in mind to increase your chances of getting an interview and ultimately matching. So before we go on to one of the biggest mistakes, which is mistake number 5, let's do some bonus points or some bonus mistakes to avoid. So what can happen is that because of not adequately planning or preparing for, having good, strong letters of recommendations, what can happen is that applicants may not have enough letters of recommendations. I've seen applicants ask like, hey, can I apply with 1 or 2 letters of recommendations? And oftentimes, or I might be mistaken, but all times the answer is no. Most programs ask for at least 3 letters of recommendations. I've even seen some programs that ask for 4. So if you only have 1 or 2 LOR, then at this point your application would be considered as incomplete, and it might not even be looked at in order to be considered for an interview because it's incomplete. So it's very important that you plan and you prepare to have all of the letters of recommendations that you need for your specialty or program of choice. So that's a big mistake, having an incomplete application due to insufficient LORs. The next point I want to lead to is that oftentimes applicants do not give the letter writer enough time to write a good letter of recommendation. So let's say that the application deadline is September 29th, like it is for this application season, and you don't ask your letter writer for a letter of recommendation until like a week or 2 before. This is insufficient time for the letter writer because 1, they have busy schedules. 2, it does take some time to have that letter of recommendation ready and for it to be uploaded into the ERAS system. And also, it is more professional to give the letter writer sufficient time to get that letter done. So just keep that in mind. A rule of thumb is that at a minimum, you should give the letter writer at least a month in advance. But if you're applying this year, you should have already asked your letter writers already, just to give them some leeway in completing your letter of recommendation on time. Now let's move on to mistake number 5. And that is having a poorly written letter of recommendation. So let's look at some components of poorly written LORs. The first one is that a poorly written LOR has red flags. So you might be wondering, how can LORs have red flags? Well, let's say the letter writer writes something like, even though Dr. B performed below average in this rotation, they tried their best to complete all the tasks that were required. That sentence has so many red flags. It highlights the fact that you are a below average performer in the specialty that you want to apply to, and it uses a term such as try to. So you try to do it does not necessarily instill confidence in program directors that you can do it. That it just states that you attempted to complete the tasks that were required. So that is a pretty drastic example of red flags, but believe you me, it can happen. But generally, using terms like try to or attempted to does not instill a lot of confidence in program directors, and it also highlights that the person writing the letter does not have any confidence in your skills either. They're just highlighting that, hey, you tried your best, but doesn't really say whether or not you were successful in completing what you needed to be done. So that's one way that red flags can be in your LOR. That's why it's so important that you choose your letter writer very, very carefully, that this will be someone that will choose all the words, the scenarios that would entice the programs to want to interview you. So the next component of a poorly written LOR is that it is very impersonal. So it's impersonal in the sense that it does not relate to a scenario or a patient where you did an outstanding job. Like you really managed that patient well, and that letter writer was impressed by this. Basically, it doesn't include any examples of your skills. Another huge component of poorly written LORs is that it can contain grammatical or spelling errors. So if a program is reading your LOR and it is fraught with spelling errors, grammatical errors, and it's just overall not very well written, this is also a red flag, because of course programs know that if a letter writer is writing a LOR for a student that they really like, that they're passionate about, that they want to thrive and survive in a great program or great specialty, they are going to take the time to write a strong LOR and make sure that they don't put the applicant at a disadvantage and avoid those errors. So if you have a poorly written LOR, this does put you at a disadvantage for getting interviews and ultimately matching. Because like I said before, LORs were ranked as the second most important factor for program directors to offer interviews. So don't take this for granted, and be sure that you ask your letter writers from now to write those letters for you, and just choose carefully. Make sure it's someone that will write a strong LOR for you, that will want you to get interviews and match. And they'll really put in that interview so that programs will be really interested in interviewing you. If you have any questions about LORs or the application process, then don't hesitate to leave them in the comment section below, and I'll be sure to respond to all of your comments. And if you like this video, please power up the like button, hit subscribe, and that notification bell so that you never ever miss another video like this. I'll be releasing a bunch of videos about the ERAS application process and do's and don'ts, so you definitely don't want to miss that. So make sure that you're subscribed. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Bye!